And here's the first question. Would we still have to use each of the country's RLD in the study?
Thank you for that question. I believe you are referring to ICHM 13. And, we understand that the acceptance of a comparator product across regions could reduce the burden of multiple clinical trials to demonstrate BE against a local comparator. However, in many territories, this is governed by local laws rather than scientific guidelines. Therefore, the acceptance of a comparator product across regions is not included in the scope of ICHM 13 at this time. There is, however, an inclusion of topic of study designs containing multiple comparator products in the scope of the first guideline in the series of ICHM 13. And the working group will be able to take some initial steps to reduce the associated burden without prejudice to any regional or local legislative requirements.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Ibrahim. Could you explain why FDA insists that a generic product should be the same pharmaceutical form with its reference-listed drug? Any particular explanation as to why EMA accepts that an RLD can be of different pharmaceutical or dosage form?
Thank you for the question. So the ANDA pathway, otherwise known as 505J, is governed under 21 CFR 314, and that by definition would define a generic drug as that containing identical inactive ingredients, dosage form, strength, as well as route of administration in order for the drug to be approved by the FDA. We can't really comment on why EMA approves a different dosage form, but what we can comment is what regulates our approval process.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question, the final question for Dr. Ibrahim in this round. As a medical oncologist, I'm disappointed that the pricing of generics is not much lower than it is. We've gone so far to support this important program, but my experience has been that the drugs in oncology are anywhere from 10 to 30% cheaper than the patented counterparts. My expectation would be greater than 50%. I would appreciate your comments.
Thank you for the question. We understand that high drug prices have a direct impact on patients. And as an agency, we are committed to facilitating increased competition in the market for prescription drugs through the approval of lower cost generic medications. We do find that for products with a single generic producer, that the generic drug is average about 39% lower in price than the brand drug when there's a single competitor. Now with two competitors, the data support that generic prices are around 54% lower than the brand drug price. And with 6 or more competitors, the generic price is around, or actually lower than 95% compared to the brand price. The FDA has no legal authority to investigate or control the price set by manufacturers or distributors or retailers, but the agency is committed to facilitating that increased competition to reduce the cost for patients.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next group of questions will be directed to Dr. Tampal. And here's the first question. Could you please explain the most appropriate way for a sponsor who has identified a data integrity issue in their own file to acknowledge such finding at the time of an ANDA submission?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Uh, so, like, if you have, as a sponsor, if you have identified the integrity issues, um, my, my recommendation would be first to follow up with the CRO for what is going on at that site, and then what's the impact of that compromised data? Because if you say integrity issue, that means there is some compromise in the data. What kind of impact does it have on the study outcome? And would you want to even submit a study where you yourself have identified the integrity issues? Now, it all depends upon the nature and the extent of the issue. So asking like in a more general way, I cannot answer the specifics, but the other thing, like, you would still describe whatever the findings are as part of your bioanalytical report also, because sometimes some issues may not rise to the level of like the ones, some of the examples that I showed, very intentional integrity issues, but it's maybe because of some sloppy work or whatever. And what's the impact of that? And all that, if that is described in the submissions, it will also save you maybe one cycle of review, because our assessors otherwise are going to ask you those questions. So yeah, the more information is included in the submissions, it is more helpful for us to understand what was going on.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question is for Dr. Tampal. If we as a sponsor discover something such as reanalyzed samples or standards at our CRO, how can we present this information in the application to correctly present this situation and prevent negative impacts on the overall study and our application?
That question too. So as I hear that question, there are a couple of things that stand out for me to answer this. One thing, it says when we discover something, which means that it may it's I'm assuming that it's not described in the bioanalytical report by the CRO, and it's like that you are finding that information, and then there is another part which says that there is a negative impact. So it's hard for me to tell, like, what type of impact, what extent of the negative impact that we are talking about over here. But in general, I would say, like, whenever samples are reanalyzed for standards and QCs are reanalyzed, the bioanalytical report should include all that information. There has to be a description of what samples were reanalyzed. That would be one thing. What was the reason for those reanalyses? Um, uh, which and sometimes you may also need to get into the root cause analysis for those unreliable samples. And then when you have reanalyzed, so now you have two sets of concentrations or data for the same samples, like, what was the rationale for selecting the final concentration that went into the PK calculations. So those are the things that you would kind of describe in the ensure that all those things are described in the submissions and in the bioanalytical reports, so that again, as our assessors are looking at the information, they can follow what's transcribed at that time. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. I have another question for Dr. Tampal. Is it expected that the bioequivalence data that is received from the CRO is reviewed by is this reviewed by a subject matter expert who may be a third-party reviewer? Can this review be submitted with the application?
Uh, so, right. So, if that's something that you are wanting to get into, to have a third party review it, if needed, if there are some more further questions and if you need to support some answers to the deficiencies, then yes, that may be helpful. But to me, I think overall it is the applicant's responsibility, right, to ensure the accuracy of the data that is submitted to the agency for bioequivalence determination. And we want to like, as a reminder, like we know compared to the new drugs for the generics, like we have only two studies, very limited studies that are conducted, mostly the fasting and the fed. We are well aware that there is very little room for unreliable data as far as the bioequivalence testing goes. And so you may have a subject matter expert, or maybe even in your own shop have your QA or the QC department look into it. That's not the report is not necessarily needed to be submitted, but if you think there is value in, like, submitting that as a part of the submission, then yes, you are welcome to do that, and we could take a look. It all depends upon the impact of that report that is having on the reliability of the data and what additional descriptions it has. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. This will be our final question in this round. And this is Dr. Tampal. What regulatory expectations apply for storing data in the cloud?
Okay. For storing data in the cloud. Okay. So at this time, we, meaning the agency, we do not have much experience for regulating the cloud service providers, right? When we are talking about the data in the cloud, um, like there are two parties here. One would be the data owner, and the other would be the cloud service provider. FDA has not issued any guidance or recommendations specifically related to the security or the integrity of the data that is stored in the cloud environment. However, as far as the data owners go, the integrity of the storage and the retrieval of the data is not any different from what you would when you would store the data in-house or locally. So we do have existing recommendations that apply when the data is wherever the data is stored. We have recommendations for ensuring the integrity for the data owner, and you may think about like, things like your staff training and qualifications. If you're thinking about moving the data to the cloud, validating the process when you're transferring the data for storage and retrieval, you may like thinking about the encryption when you are doing the compressing and the decompressing of the data to be moved back and forth in the cloud. So these are some of the aspects of the validation of those processes that you may think of. Another one that comes to mind may be the audit trails during those transfers. So it is very, it would not be much different for the data owners, as I said, compared to whether it's in the cloud or whether it's at your own local environment. The responsibilities for that would be the same. And as far as I would say the cloud service providers and those platforms go, we don't have much experience at this time to speak on that. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. The next group of questions will be directed to Dr. Cobourne-Duval. And here's the first question. Is there a time limit for response to an initial communication regarding a remote review?
Thank you for that question. It is 15 working days, similar to an on-site inspection. In the case there are observations, the site does have 15 working days to respond to the observation. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Cobourne-Duval. Can a remote record generate a 483?
Thank you for that question. Although you can get observations or findings, inspectional findings through a remote record review, it is not a FDA form FDA 483. So to answer that question, from a remote record review, it will not be a 483 issue. But if there are findings or observations during that remote record review, we will cite them and communicate them to the review division. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Cobourne-Duval. How and when during the review of a generic drug application is an OSIS or OSIS inspection triggered?
Repeat the question, please. I think my internet cut out, but could you repeat the question, please?
Be happy to repeat the question. How and when during the review of a generic drug application is an OSIS or OSIS inspection triggered?
We have a team in our office that does the evaluations, and so it is multiple aspects that are taken into account to select whether or not a site is inspected or if there's a remote record review. But it's not as simple as something triggered it. It's multi aspects that are taken into consideration when we look at the applications, when we look at the site, we look at the inspection history to decide, the team decides whether or not the site is selected for remote record review or an inspection. So it's not singularly something that triggers it per se. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Dr. Cobourne-Duval. How long does the remote record review take?
The remote record review is conducted in a similar fashion and time frame as an on-site inspection would be. Typically, it's about a week, but it could be slightly longer or slightly shorter, depending on the workload and what has to be covered, depending on the complexity of the actual studies and if things as the studies and the work dictates. But typically, it's conducted in a similar fashion in terms of time as an on-site inspection, but it could vary. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next group of questions will be directed to Dr. Keck, and here's the first question. When a generic drug manufacturer wants to change their packaging, for example, for an older stopper to a newer formulated stopper that is deemed to be cleaner, what would be some of the steps they would need to do? Certain studies often can take some time, which can delay drugs getting to the market. This can be an issue with drugs that are shorted in the market and wondering if there is potentially a faster path for generic drug companies to follow.
Thank you for this question. And just as a disclaimer, the Pharm Tox team doesn't do the initial assessment about what the questioner is asking about. This is a question about potential extractable and leachable impurities that would come out through new components of the container closure system. And it's actually the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality who would do that initial risk assessment to look at what's coming out. And so I would recommend getting in touch with OPQ, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, to talk about what types of extractable, leachable studies you can conduct to ensure that your new stopper in this example is in fact cleaner and not a safety concern. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question for Dr. Keck. Do GLP inspections impact GDUFA goal dates for review of the original ANDA submission or amendment?
Thank you for that question. And I'm really glad this question was asked, because that's really why I came here to talk today. And the answer is potentially. It is absolutely a concern that GLP inspections can impact GDUFA goal dates. So the PharmTox team is a consult division. And so we don't start our review when the ANDA first comes in, when the review clock starts, unless maybe the Division of Filing Review catches early on in the review clock that a PharmTox consult is needed. And that is uncommon. It is often well into the ANDA review cycle that we are consulted. When we do our review and flag a GLP study, PharmTox takes the request for a GLP inspection very seriously, and we consult internally before we initiate that request. All that to say, much of the ANDA review cycle has passed by the time we have received our consult, reviewed the data, flagged an issue, and determined that a GLP inspection is required for us to move forward with a reviewing GLP study. We have had situations where a GLP inspection was ongoing and pending and getting close to the GDUFA goal date, and we've had to have discussions about whether we would delay the response to the applicant or delay the GDUFA goal date, or just go ahead and issue a deficiency and let the ANDA applicant know that there is a pending GLP inspection. So yes, it can absolutely impact GDUFA goal dates. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. The next question is sort of in the format of a statement, and we'll get Dr. Keck to respond to this. The safety of component excipient is dependent on the duration and dose and based on the population, say, of a child or adult. However, that kind of differentiation is not available in the IID database. It's becoming difficult to access safety of components.
Thank you for that question. And I absolutely empathize with applicants out there about this issue. The IID is helpful in that it allows applicants to see what excipients have been approved, but due to us avoiding releasing potentially proprietary information, we can't be specific about what drug product it is that has those excipients. And so we can't, it's difficult for us to communicate what the patient population is for that particular excipient that's approved. And so we have the mechanism of submitting controlled correspondences where you can receive input about whether a particular excipient at a particular dose is safe in your proposed drug product. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one last question for Dr. Keck. And here's the question. What is the benefit of having a GLP compliant study conducted?
And thank you for that question. So compliance is the key word here. For a study to be FDA GLP compliant, that means it follows the good laboratory practices outlined in 21 CFR Part 58, also known as Good Laboratory Practice for Non-Clinical Laboratory Studies. So what benefit does that add for a study to be GLP compliant? The very purpose of Part 58 outlining non-clinical study GLP practices is to, and I quote the regulation here, assure the quality and integrity of the safety data filed. So if a study follows this outlined GLP practices in Part 58, then we can have a higher level of confidence in the study's quality and integrity. That is why we evaluate for GLP compliance and flag studies that are out of compliance and evaluate the compliance issue. We very much need to be able to confidently rely on the data that are submitted. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. That was our last question for this first Q&A panel. We want to thank all of our panelists for answering many and numerous questions that came in during